tell us a little bit about the situation that you found yourself in as you essentially came under attack.
Sure. Well, basically, these poor people that have already been shelled endlessly by the Russians, have been under Russian occupation, then, on top of everything, have this massive flood, some of their houses completely underwater, and are fleeing for their lives. And then, quite unbelievably, on top of that, the Russians have been shelling the people fleeing and the people trying to help them. So on Friday afternoon, when I was there at the rescue point with all the volunteers that have come from all over the country, and in fact some British volunteers as well, suddenly there was this whistling noise. There's shelling going on all the time in the distance, but it's like quite far away. But then suddenly there was this whistling sound, and everybody just ran and threw themselves down. And there was about 8 shells that came into the rescue area on Friday. And then yesterday morning, they did the same thing. Actually, we were lucky in a way because we were kind of cursing because we were being held up at the military checkpoint outside the entrance to the city. But had we got there at the time we were planning to, we would have been there when that shelling was happening too.
So how often is this shelling happening at the moment?
It's been happening the last few days, once a day, really. It's been in the afternoons the other day, but yesterday it was in the morning. So,
and this is sorry, go on, Christina.
No, I was going to say, it's just a few shells, but yesterday one man was killed and 2 people were injured.
And this is a really desperate situation anyway in Kherson. There are people who are still very much stranded and need the help and support of the rescuers, not least then having to contend with the shells. Just explain to us what the situation is like and what you saw there on Friday.
Yeah, so, this massive dam, one of the biggest dams in Europe that has been destroyed, flooding many villages, and Kherson, which is a big city in the south, is actually large parts of it underwater. So where there's this sort of makeshift port where all the boats are going out to try and rescue people, is actually a crossroads, but it doesn't look like it. It's all underwater, and it's a kind of bizarre scene because so many people have come to try and help, and they've brought any kind of motley craft that they can get hold of. So there's like some really old tin boats and kayaks and all sorts of things, and a lot of the rescues are animals because everybody here seems to have pets, and people who may have got out at the beginning and their pets are still there. So there was a sort of stream of cats and dogs, mostly cats, being rescued, and people putting them into pet carriers and feeding them.
And it's worth remembering as well that there are people who are in Russian-occupied territory who are trying to use this opportunity to escape as well, but, with huge risk.
Sure. So the Dnipro River, which is flooded, goes through Kherson, and the left bank of the river is still under Russian occupation. You might remember that Kherson was the city that was occupied for the longest by the Russians, but was liberated in November. However, the left bank of the river was not liberated, so those villages have stayed under Russian occupation. And actually, the worst effect of the flooding is on that side, the Russian side. And so what's happened is some people have taken, it's not really that they've taken advantage of it, they're just trying to get out. And the rescuing is mostly being done by the Ukrainians. So some of the rescues have been on that side of the river. And so people are coming out who are not just, absolutely relieved to have escaped this flooding, which people are describing their houses completely submerged, but also that find themselves in Ukraine, that isn't occupied, and so very emotional scenes. Some of the people that are arriving. There's also been reports that a couple of Russians have come over, but the Ukrainians have been a little bit secretive about that.
And as, of course, the waters start to recede, there's real dangers of things like landmines in the water that have travelled a distance.
Absolutely. I mean, look, this is a massive humanitarian and ecological disaster. The water is filthy that you see there. It's all like the colour of tea. It's oily. It's smelly. And so, it's going to be very hazardous. There's quite possibly going to be cholera afterwards. Fish are going to die. This area is one of the richest agricultural areas. So a lot of the agricultural area has been sort of turned into a boggy wasteland. But then the other thing is that a lot of the area had been mined by the Russians. And of course, the rising water levels have shifted those mines, and they're mines that have been seen as actually coming up on the Black Sea coast in Odessa. So they were warning yesterday that rescue operation is going to be very hazardous now, because as the water levels go down, not only may there be obstacles, I mean, cars and things that you can't see underwater, but also these mines that are like floating bombs that people could end up crashing into.
Christina, I must also ask you about another piece that you've written for the Sunday Times today, where you've been speaking to the mother of a teenage soldier, one of the youngest, who died on the front line, just really bringing home the personal human cost for so many families in Ukraine.
This was so sad. This was this lady called Irina, who has two sons. Her eldest son, Max, was 18, only just 18 when the war started, had everything to live for. He was a very talented saxophonist. He was in the local orchestra in Poltava, where they lived. He was at music school. He was hoping to go abroad to be a professional musician. He loved cats. He loved Formula One. He had a girlfriend, and he went and volunteered the day after the war started. And his mum, Irina, was horrified, but he said, look, if I don't protect you and Poltava, who will? And she kind of thought, well, he's only just 18. They're not going to send him anywhere really dangerous. He's never held a gun in his life. But he ended up on the front lines in the east. And 2 days before he was due to come back for his first break, he was killed by a Russian shell. So it's an absolutely heartbreaking story. And this lady telling the story, she was so determined to tell his story. She was really like this sort of brittle bravery. She was perfectly made up and dressed. But obviously crying as she was telling it. And actually, I also have a son of a similar age who plays saxophone. So, listening to that just really brings home the terrible, terrible cost of this war.